Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Inequality, Wealth, and Financing Recovery. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mr. Ahmed Said, to open the session. Mr. Said, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Professor Khatib Basri, Professor Atif Mia, Professor Rima Hana, Professor Atisam Ahmed, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be, we're grateful to you for making time in your busy schedules to join us. It's an honor to welcome everyone to this session entitled Inequality, Wealth, and Financing Recovery, and jointly organized by the Asian Development Bank and the International Economic Association. I'll just say a couple of words to set the table, and then we will turn quickly to the very distinguished and insightful panel that we've assembled. Every era has its zeitgeist, and if there's a single animating theme for the first quarter of the economic history of the 21st century, it may well be that of inequality. And while it's certainly true that some gaps have grown smaller, and the emergence of a vibrant middle class across Asia is a preeminent example of this, in other dimensions, extreme inequality has grown markedly worse. This is true within developed countries, with effects that we'll discuss in this panel, and with implications that range far beyond those countries. And it's also true within developing countries. In the last 2 years, we have all been involved, the world has been involved in fighting COVID-19. This is a disease that discriminates. The poorest people, the weakest companies, the neediest countries, all have suffered disproportionately as a consequence of COVID-19. And so our subject is a broad one, I know, but also a very topical one. And I'll say once again, I'm very honored and grateful to this group of scholars for taking time to join us, and I should say both practitioners and scholars. And so with that, perhaps we'll turn to the questions. And I'd like to open, Professor Mia, by giving you the floor. You've done some really fascinating and path-breaking work on the savings glut of the rich and how it affects the macroeconomy. If you could be so kind enough to give us a brief overview of your analysis of this phenomena, but also if you could highlight what implications you think your work has for the development strategies pursued by developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed and the ADB for having me. As Ahmed, you mentioned in your opening remarks, one of the most important forces in the global economy over the last, I would say 40 years or so, has been the rise of inequality. And when I say rise of inequality, it's really important to emphasize that it's the rise in extreme inequality that's defined it. And by extreme inequality, I mean the rise in income of the top 1% of the population. And this is a global phenomenon, really. It's obviously a very strong trend in the US, but it's really there throughout advanced countries and actually many other fast emerging economies as well. This is a relatively slow moving but very persistent force. So the share of top 1% of income has almost doubled over this time period. And the implications of this particular phenomena are really deep, and that's something I want to just touch upon. Why are the implications of this rise in extreme inequality so strong? Well, the basic reason is that individuals in the top 1% of the distribution, they behave very differently from the rest of the population. And in particular, individuals in the top 1%, they save at a much higher rate out of their lifetime or permanent income, as we technically refer to sometimes, compared to the rest of the population. So now combine this fact that they save at a much higher rate with the fact that there has been an almost doubling of the share of income going to this top 1% of the population. And what you have is an obvious implication, which we refer to as the saving glut of the rich. That is to say, as a greater share of income goes to the top 1%, since they save at a much higher rate, you're going to have, all else equal, sort of a rise in gross global savings. And this cannot happen in equilibrium. Something has to give in overall supply equals demand equilibrium. So what is that? Well, one possibility could have been that this rise in global gross savings was met with an equivalent rise in global investment, in which case this would have been great. We have a rise in saving combined with a rise in investment, and since growth is driven by investment, everything would have been tremendous. The economy would have grown at a higher rate than before. We do not see that at all. In fact, overall investment has not risen over the same 40 years. If anything, there has been a gradual decline in global investment as a share of GDP. So combine this fact of stagnant investment with the other fact of rising inequality and hence the rising saving glut of the rich, and we have a conundrum. This increase in supply of saving must be met on the demand side with an equivalent rise in demand of something, and that something has not been investment. So what does the economy do in such a situation? Well, what we have seen globally is that there's been this rise in dependence on credit to generate demand, to generate consumption, which is debt-driven or credit-driven consumption. And we have seen this the world over. And again, one very basic fact that illuminates this is rise in credit to GDP the world over. Now, the last thing I'll say is that this rise in credit-driven demand, which itself is a result of rising inequality and saving glut of the rich, as I mentioned, is only possible, is only sustainable if this rising debt is combined with falling interest rates so as to make this debt sustainable at a global level. And that's something, again, that we've seen this rise in credit and fall in interest rates all the way down to zero. So this, in a nutshell, is the story of the saving glut of the rich, if you will. This phenomena we refer to, joint work with Ludwig Straub and Amir Sufi, we refer to as indebted demand. What are the implications of that? Well, the first obvious implication of that is that interest rates have to continue to go down to sustain this equilibrium, but it's not possible for interest rates to go beyond zero. And so at that point, the economy starts to stagnate. And that's where we are today, that we are in a sort of a demand-driven secular stagnation, as it is sometimes referred to, which has tremendous problems for global growth. And obviously, the last part of your question, it has problems for developing countries as well. Hopefully, we can talk more about this if we have time. But just the key implication, there are many others, but one that I would focus on in this session is that for developing countries, it's important to emphasize that while interest rates are zero and they can borrow for free, so to speak, apparently, it's important that that borrowing is used not for consumption purposes, but for investment purposes. I think that's the core focus that developing countries need to have as we look forward. I'll stop there, but then, if there are further questions, I'll be happy to dig into those.
Thank you, Atif. I think that sets us up very, very nicely for our next panelist, Rima Hanna, Professor Hanna. Professor Hanna, your work has really focused on the poorest, and I know you've been involved with a number of countries in Asia, advising governments both before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe if we pivot the focus for a moment from these, long-standing secular trends, which are extremely powerful, to more recent history. Could you perhaps share with us a bit of what you're seeing in terms of the long-term scarring effect of the pandemic on the poorest, and how should governments be responding, and where should they be focused?
No, this is such an important question. So thank you for having me here today. It is really an honor to be with such an illustrious panel. I know I'm just going to learn a lot from everyone as well here. It's a tough question in the sense that I don't think we really fully comprehend right now just how bad the effect of the COVID pandemic is going to be on the poorest of the poor. Normally, when we try to understand impacts on poverty, try to understand impacts on inequality, we collect this through household surveys and data. The pandemic stalled a lot of these. They're starting to happen now, and so data is just starting to come in. So I think we'll have a much clearer picture in the months ahead. If you look at a lot of the estimates, though, coming out of places like the World Bank, whereas in recent history, extreme poverty has been falling in many places around the world, many of the international organizations, I've seen estimates of, you can see another 90 million people falling into extreme poverty as a result of the COVID pandemic. So I think we think it'll be quite bad. We don't fully know the extent. I think for me, when I think about the poverty, I think of it in terms of both the short run, the medium run, and the long run. So right now in the short run, while, in some countries, so for example, in the US, where I'm very lucky and vaccines are becoming more widespread and the disease is getting more under control, and you're starting to see businesses come back. In a lot of developing countries, vaccines are not widespread, and many are going through surges right now. And so you're worried as surges are happening, as lockdowns are occurring, as demand for businesses are happening in the short run, just increased vulnerability, increased poverty. As countries, ideally as more vaccines start coming out and we start thinking about the medium run, the second question is going to be are the jobs that were lost, or are the small businesses that are lost, are they going to come back? Are they going to look different when they come back? These moves into technology that started occurring before the pandemic in developing countries and really raced forward in a lot of developing countries. Is that going to speed up automation in a lot of developing countries in the same way we're seeing it happen in richer countries worldwide? And then the third, and one where I'm actually very concerned, is about really long run poverty and intergenerational poverty. So all of the research just tells you how important early childhood investments in kids are. And we have two different problems occurring at the same time here. So first of all, many families have lost their jobs. There's not an FTE. There's not the kind of investments you would see in kids. It's the kind of decrease of investments we'd see in typical types of recessions. But then you have this other problem that in many countries, the schools have been shut. The schools, in some countries, the schools have been shut for about 1.5 years now. And we don't know what the implications are going to be as kids come back into the classroom, how this disruption is going to affect learning. And we don't know if a lot of kids are actually going to come back. Especially really vulnerable kids, at the age, 13, 14, where we're trying to keep kids in school. If the pandemic is just going to knock them off the kind of track that we would expect. And so I think, for me, there's three different things when I think about what needs to be done. I mean, the first thing, and this is the thing that many experts and many people have been saying since the beginning of the pandemic, is that we need to get the virus under control in many countries. We really need to make a big push in vaccine distribution. It's only then can we really start to really think about how we reopen the economy. The second, and this one I think is really important, is while there's been a big push, and like, for example, in a lot of richer countries in the US about trying to open schools and open schools safely, and in a lot of developing countries, the schools have just been shut. And so I think there really, really needs to be a push here to thinking about what the government can do to get them open, but get them open in a way that, teachers feel comfortable, parents feel comfortable sending their kids there, and with what other additional investments you might need to try to help, given all the disruptions that kids have faced in the last 1.5 years. And then the third, I'll just briefly note, is we really need to be thinking more about how we do social protection and making it more targeted to those in need. And by here, when I talk about social protection, I'm talking about, cash transfers and other poverty relief, but also thinking about how do we do active labor market policies better. And so I'll stop here. But I'd love to have a more rosier picture, but I must say I'm really concerned about what this situation is going to look like in terms of inequality in developing countries and poverty in general in the coming years, and the track that we're on if we don't do something extreme in the meantime.
Thank you, Professor Hanna. That was a very, very sobering perspective, albeit not surprising. Next, let's turn to Professor Ihtisham Ahmed. We've now heard both about the growing gaps in developing countries as a consequence of COVID-19, as well as about the fiscal demands on countries to address those gaps. In light of this, Professor Ahmed, could you share your perspective, and you've worked extensively with countries across the region, on, perhaps at a high level of generality, the fiscal state of regional economies. As Professor Mia noted, monetary policy is less and less effective as a tool. What other levers do governments have? How much fiscal space do they have? to invest in reinstating the pre-pandemic growth trajectories.
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you very much. I think the distinction between countries that have adequate domestic resource mobilization, at least 15% is a cutoff point. And here one can make a distinction in Asia, for example, between China, which has moved from 10% to 20% in the last 20 years, but actually it was done in a fairly short period of time in the early 1990s, and countries like Indonesia and Pakistan, which are stuck at around 10% of GDP. There are a few countries in the middle, but this gives you an idea of the range we are speaking about. Country like Pakistan, which is in yet another IMF program as we speak, has no fiscal space even for basic spending. 10% of GDP covers defense, interest payments, and administration. So when you're talking about basic healthcare, education, you're really looking at very stretched budgets. At the general government level, when you get down to local governments, you have a serious problem because that's where services are actually provided. The Chinese case, although they have done very well on the domestic resource mobilization front, you still have a problem at the local level. And that's linked to the fact that the tax reforms in China have led to a centralization of revenues. And what local governments have now are essentially transfers and shared revenues. Although China has, the highest saving rate in the world, so there's really the glut of savings. It also has huge inequality, probably the highest in Asia. The ability to use those savings for public investments is actually not as it might appear. They have tried to put in local government bond systems. There is a lot of borrowing, but that has led to an overhang of debt, which is now causing serious problems at the local level. And it's unknown because they don't have proper balance sheets. So you have an explosion of debt, which is constraining the ability of the central government to take action. So the fiscal stimulus this time around is around 4% of GDP, as opposed to 10% or more during the 2008-10 financial crisis. So the debt overhang restricts what the Chinese government is able to do. But there are lessons from what the Chinese have done in terms of improving national resources for countries like Pakistan and Indonesia. The focus in Pakistan now on getting hold of the personal income tax essentially is constrained by the fact the personal income tax is really a tax on wages, and non-wage incomes are out of the net. So really, when you tax wages, you have a regressive tax, and that supplements a set of tax exemptions on the value-added tax, or GST as they call it in Pakistan, which is dictated by the need to protect 70-year-old infant industries. So the question of what you are borrowing to invest for is actually quite critical. So you're borrowing to support industries that perhaps have passed their use-by date. Of course, that's tied up with the political economy, the fact that you have implicit inequality in governance structures as well as income structures. So I think what one has is a problem of inequality, even in countries with domestic resource mobilization, but the problem of actually addressing the right instruments to intermediate, particularly to provide financing for public services at the local level, I think is work in progress. We can come in to look at some of the options, that some of us have been exploring, particularly in the issue of providing sustainable employment generation in interior compact cities. It's been something that's been on the Chinese plan for the last 20 years. It hasn't really worked very well. So really it's a question of how one actually does it, is to link it to local public services and the ability to finance and get good governance at the local level. And something that we can come back to in questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ahmed. Next, we'll turn to Pak Katib. Now, I think development economics is very much a practitioner science. And Pak Katib, you've served both as finance minister as well as an academic and as an astute observer of the development trajectory of one of the region's most fascinating countries. We're now a decade into quantitative easing by the Fed. Professor Mia at the outset placed that into an even broader context of long-term declines in global interest rates. We'll soon be 2 years into the COVID-19 crisis. Based on what you've heard, how do you, as a former policymaker, think about the policy choices confronting a country like Indonesia? Should it and other countries like it take a more aggressive approach to public investments? Or should they continue to be cautious and prudent in terms of building up imbalances in financial markets? You know, I guess in some ways the question I'm asking is how do we balance debt and development going forward?
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and thanks for having me as well. I agree with what Professor Mian said about the risk of the debt dependent, because this saving gluts of the rich. But you know, as a former Minister of Finance, I'm fully aware about the risk of this debt dependent and tend to be conservative. But on the other hand, I also understand the need of the aggressive public investment. Yeah, especially we heard from Rima, for example. She mentioned about some issues about the possibility of the risk of the K-shaped recovery, because the issue of this some vulnerable group will be affected by the pandemic. Students learn from home. They need to get an access for the digital, the vaccine inequality. So all of this will require the government or the public investment. So to me, the issue is not only a matter just a sort of like the risk of this debt dependent, because this saving gluts of the rich. By the way, it is very interesting when I heard about from Professor Mian about the indicators of the rising credit to GDP. In the case of Indonesia, it's the other way around. The credit to GDP is declining. Yeah, and then it's also very interesting, while we are having a problem of this rising inequality, I think one of the reasons behind it was not because the saving the gluts of the rich, but because the commodity boom, the Dutch disease, somehow have an impact on the rising inequality in Indonesia. So back again to your question, seems to me that the keywords is actually about how do we spend the money. And I agree with Professor Mian. If we use this money for the unproductive one, that will be dangerous. But if the government spend this money, for example, to provide an access for the poor people in terms of this clean water, and also we provide an access for school, for education, or also we reallocate some funding from the so-called like the subsidy or the fossil fuel and giving the money to the like a cash transfer. I think somehow this will improve the issue of this problem of the rising inequality. Because as the case for Indonesia, when I was at the MOF, I adjusted the fuel price by 40%, to reduce the fossil fuel subsidy and then relocate the money for the poor people. Somehow this will help to improve the issue of this inequality. So back to your question again, I think the issue is not about that we have to choose whether we have to worry about this debt dependent or public investment. I think the government need to continue to invest in the public investment, but the question is the quality of spending. Yeah, that's really the important thing. Uh, the second aspect that's also very important, and Etisam mentioned about it, I completely agree with him that that ratio tax to GDP in Indonesia as of today is less than 10%, and will be very difficult for the country like Indonesia to provide the social security, allocate spending for health, to support the small medium enterprise. So like it or not, we have to do reform on the tax sector as well. But the question is, it's not easy to do reform on the tax sector, like you raising the tax rates, because it's gonna have an impact for the poor people as well to the consumption. So I think we have to look at this issue more on the short term and the long term. Yeah, Rema, myself, Alkan, and Mayara, we wrote a paper and proposed to the government. Probably it's better to focus on the reform on the administrative rather than the tax rate. Yeah, because somehow this will be politically, acceptable. And this, if we do this kind of things, somehow we could address the concern raised by Etisham about the ability of the country to finance their budget deficit. But again, back to your question, Ahmed, I think it is very important for the government to continue to invest in the public investment. Yeah, infrastructure, provide the basic needs, because like a clean water or access. But at the same time, I'm fully aware that the issue of this saving glass of the rich could have an impact. Bring the rest of the country to become that dependent. I leave it up here.
Thank you. So now we'll turn to the second part of our session, a bit more of an open conversation. And I'll just kick it off with a bit of an open-ended question, but I'd encourage the panelists, to jump in and let's try to get a little bit of engagement amongst the group. One of the questions I was thinking about as I was hearing this was, we were talking about mobilizing developed world capital for developing world needs. We talked also about domestic resource mobilization. But in fact, and Ethisham, you alluded to this when you spoke about China and you sort of referenced this issue. Asia is a region with excess savings. What more can we do to utilize regional savings for regional development? Is this an appropriate area of inquiry? Is it the right question to be asking? And if it is, then what more can we be doing along these lines? Maybe I'll just open that up to anyone who wants to take a first stab at it.
I think you talked about China. They have a difficulty in accessing their own savings for investment at the subnational level. And that's because of really two reasons. One is that you need own source revenues at the subnational level to be able to borrow in a sustainable manner. And they don't have that. But that's a problem also in Indonesia and Pakistan, because the property tax, which has been copied from the valuation and ownership model in the US, doesn't work. It doesn't work in Pakistan, it doesn't work in India, it doesn't work in Mexico. It was tried in Shanghai and Chongqing and it failed. So the question really is, what do you do at the local level? Well, you can do piggybacking on a tax at the national level. For example, a carbon tax, and that could be quite useful in also reducing congestion and pollution in large metropolitan areas. But you can also think about, in this work we've been doing in a number of countries, is to think about a beneficial property tax based on occupancy and size and location. It's going back to an idea of Alfred Marshall, that if you link a tax which is very much in your face to public services, then the political constraints are somewhat dissipated. And our estimation is that you can get 1.5 to 2% of GDP relatively easily in countries like Mexico, Pakistan, and China, without the need to go through very complex cadasters and also verifying ownership. So that's really the constraint. But if you have that, you also need to have full information on local government balance sheets so you can actually borrow. So you need own source revenues to be able to finance your debt in the medium term. And as Shatib said, this is a medium term agenda. A municipal bond system doesn't work without municipal taxation. Own source revenues, but also full information on really how the spending is being used. Is it actually being used for productive purposes or not? So I think there are a set of issues which come together in really a whole of government approach in dealing with the sustainable development agenda and of course also provision of the right sort of investment, which takes into account human capital, social capital, natural capital, and then that's also reflected in the tax system. This is work that's underway, and I think we do have an opportunity to share some of this.
Can I jump in, Ahmed?
Please,
Yeah.
of course. Please.
Yeah. Let me share my perspective from the issue of the regional financial safety net. Yeah, it is very interesting to observe that many Asian countries started to building their foreign reserve after the Asian financial crisis. Because one thing that we learned from the Asian financial crisis actually is you are on your own. Politically, it will be very difficult for the Asian countries to go to the IMF to get a support because politically it's almost impossible. Look at the case of Singapore during the global financial crisis. They didn't go to the IMF. They went to the Fed, similar to Korea, a country like Indonesia. So as a result, most of the ASEAN countries will continue to building the reserve, as an insurance to address this issue. And then once you sort of like you build the reserve, like country like Singapore, where do they put the money? Through the sovereign wealth fund. They start to invest in other countries. China do the same by putting sort of like buying the US government bond, for example. So that kind of issue is also somehow play a factors. So it is important, to in the future to discuss about this, the importance of the regional safety net. But unfortunately, I have to say that in Asia, we do have the so-called the Chiang Mai initiative, but still untested. When I had to manage the taper tantrum 2013, we didn't go to the IMF, we didn't go to the Chiang Mai. What we did at that time is we tried to get the bilateral swap with ADB, with Japan, with Australia. So that kind of issue somehow will encourage country to accumulate savings, which is probably, what they are doing it because the preparation, if they have to address the issue of the financial crisis one day.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
I'm happy to jump in, Ahmad, here.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So the point that Mr. Basri mentioned regarding lessons learned from East Asian crisis is an extremely important one. And let me sort of say it in maybe one other way, which is not all capital is created equal. And I think that's very important to keep in mind when we talk about how one can use apparent excess savings in some parts of your regional economy. If you end up using that excess savings by importing capital, but you use it for consumption purposes, or you use it for real estate or other non-tradable sectors, that's going to lead to what, again, Mr. Basri mentioned as Dutch disease kind of phenomena, and it ends up terribly wrong, as again, we saw East Asia, but there are many other examples of such sudden stops. So that's the first thing. Not all capital is created equal. So if you're in a developing country, you have to have a very independent and a very active macro-prudential policy that prevents such inflows of foreign capital that is tending to promote Dutch disease style phenomena by funding consumption, by funding non-tradable sectors, That's point number one. Point number two is kind of the complement of that, which is, okay, fine. If all capital is not created equal and we don't want consumption-driven financing, what do we do instead? And this other point is, I would say, somewhat less appreciated, but it's an extremely important one. It's actually quite an obvious point once you think about it. And that is, developing countries are actually almost never capital constrained. Now, when I say it, you may say, oh, this is a big statement. Developing countries are not capital constrained. Developing countries are investment constrained. Developing countries are technologically constrained. That's what you need to import. You don't need to import capital. Capital actually is secondary. So the reason you may allow Chinese capital to come in is not because you need quote unquote Chinese capital, but because you may need Chinese technology. So make sure that when you import, and when I say Chinese, the more generally, I mean foreign capital. Make sure that when you import foreign capital, that is to say, when you borrow internationally, you must make sure that you're borrowing it along with technology transfer, number one, and along with a process that's leading to a rise in investment. That's the other related phenomena that is important. And, and to make sure that that investment is in productive, tradable sectors, or in sectors, if you want to think of public financing, in sectors that boost domestic productivity defined broadly. So, rises in education, public health, all of that would qualify because all of that investment raises domestic productivity, as someone like, Hannah knows very well, that, basic literacy, basic health that boosts productivity going forward. So that would be my sort of a main takeaway. Again, not all capital is created equal. And when you think of borrowing, think of the constraints that you have, which is really investment and technology.
To add one thing, so I agree with everything that's been said today, and I just wanted to note, I was glad that you mentioned, Atif, about also the investments on health and education, but I do want to note one other form of spending that is slightly unusual right now, but is very necessary, is basic consumption spending for the very poor. As many countries in Asia right now are currently experiencing surges, and we're asking people to lock down to reduce the presence of the virus in many of these countries. And first, just from an ethical point of view, can't ask people to stay home without giving them enough to eat. And second, the lockdowns are not going to be successful if you don't give people enough to eat, if you do not do enough consumption spending just for the very basic of the poor, because people won't stay home, because especially people who live day to day. And so it's the one aspect that I don't want us to forget during this conversation, that we're also living in a time right now in Asia where the pandemic is still raging in many countries, and we can't forget that the poorest of the poor they need our help too.
Yeah, thank you, Rima. I think that's a great point. And I want to actually come back to it in a minute, but I wanted to pick up on one other point first, which I thought Atif was a really important comment you made, that capital is secondary. And one of the things that I find in our conversation about development is so much of it is about the dollars. Money mobilized, dollars delivered. And in fact, this is a lagging indicator of success, right? I mean, this is what happens if you create a successful context, then the capital flows. And I guess one of the questions I have is, and this is opening up, I think, the aperture of inquiry quite a bit, is, is the architecture of both international capital flows, including institutions like ours, but also the domestic architecture of support, is it designed right to facilitate the types of flows, i.e. technology, investment ideas, FDI, equity, that are consistent with driving up domestic productivity? And so I think here, for example, of a very interesting experiment happening in Indonesia, which is what they're referring to as a new sovereign wealth fund, but what I would characterize actually as an equity-focused domestic national development bank. I mean, it's not a sovereign wealth fund in the sense of managing external reserves and deploying them outside the country. It's actually an entity that seeks to attract foreign equity capital. So it's a question for the panel, do we have the right sets of institutions or policies or framework to facilitate the kind of capital that we think sounds like we think it's available in scale? It sounds like the countries need it. But are we set up right to facilitate that process?
I'm happy to take that on, Ahmed. The short answer is no, absolutely not. And in fact, it's for that reason that I briefly mentioned the importance of having an active and independent macroprudential policy. And if you want an example of what that means, look no further than China and the experience that China had and the policies they followed since the 90s. China, a view that you are short dollars for development is rejected by the Chinese experience. As is very well known, China not only grew at a tremendous pace, but it has been a net lender of dollars to the rest of the world. And that's again also very much related with the issues that Mr. Basri was talking about earlier. But in terms of the architecture, it is up to, we don't have an international architecture that does that, for example. So money can flow in. In fact, unfortunately, it's been the other way around. Like if you look at institutions like the IMF, they've been promoting kind of liberalization without regard to these kind of dimensions that we are talking about. And the result of that is that money can come in, for example, just for speculation in the real estate sector, or portfolio investment, which is just leading to speculation in secondary equity markets without leading to FDI or capital formation domestically. When that kind of capital moves in, it does no benefit to the domestic economy. In fact, it does a harm precisely because of the rise of Dutch disease style phenomena. So what to do, how to respond to that? Well, I hope that multilateral international agencies like the ADB, like the IMF, I very much hope that we raise a conversation on that particular dimension. But short of that, if you are from a developing country, you cannot wait for the ADB or the IMF to come up with the right set of policies. You have to take in charge of your own destiny, so to speak. And you need to put in place domestic macro-prudential policies. That's a super important sort of point to keep in mind, in my view. And there are so many developing countries, Pakistan among them, that have not sort of taken on the importance of this question, and they do not have an active macroprudential policy. The way you want to design it is that you want to disincentivize capital coming in that goes into non-productive real estate or other such sectors, and you want to incentivize a very focused global capital that is going into tradable sector, productivity driven, and really investment that is combined with technology transfer. If it's not coming with technology transfer defined broadly, you basically, as I said earlier, you don't need it. Just do something else. You don't need it. It's going to hurt you more than it's going to benefit you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Asma. I have to say I'm very tempted now to put Ehtesham, who's an ex-senior IMF official, on the spot to respond to those comments. I don't know, Ehtesham, if you have any.
I think it's Atif is exactly right. You need a proper macroprudential policy, and we've been trying to do that, in the Pakistan case for well on 30 years. The trouble is that macroprudential involves the public finances as well, and they have not been able to, or have not wanted to address domestic resource mobilization because, and I think here there's political economy. It's they've been relying on geographic rents. It's shall we say, a non-IMF way of looking at things. But I've come to the conclusion that it's not that they didn't know what to do, but they didn't want to do it. Here it's linked very closely to the inequality issues. So, if you have an elite that is doing very well, thank you very much. You have all your, trappings of wealth. You come and go. You've got foreign capital coming in. You can buy more houses and cars and so on. And, somebody will pay the bill. You can't keep running a country of 210 million people with 10% tax GDP ratio. You're spending 20% on defense and administration and unproductive investment, as Atif is saying. So really, I think that the whole macro situation is a bit of a disaster. The tax instruments don't work. You have a income tax that should be redistributive. It's actually inequality and enhancing. You have a VAT which should be encouraging investment and creating a level playing field, and all it does is to make it more difficult to export because of the tax breaks and breaks in the value chain that add to the cost of doing business. Exactly the opposite. Then you have a property tax that doesn't work. So at no level of government have you any accountability. So it's basically, will the Americans bail you out, or the IMF will bail you out? You're into the 15th IMF program. They're in an IMF program as we speak. And the review has been postponed. So, the question is, what the government wants to do, and there are some good people, is to do the sort of public investment and growing out of the pandemic in a sustainable manner. The problem is that if you have a gaping fiscal deficit and current account deficit, there's very limited amount of public action. And you can't keep breaking IMF program after IMF program. In any case, don't listen to what the IMF says. I mean, you've got, you're into the 15th program, tax GDP ratio is still where it was, actually lower than where it was in 1990. Whereas the Chinese have actually used ADB assistance and IMF assistance and World Bank assistance very intelligently by building up institutions, fiscal instruments, and have done it in a manner which I think is an example to the Pakistans of the world, or Mexico's for that matter. Well, there's been a bit of back and forth between Mexico and China. That's a separate issue. They've learned from each other. So, when you say that, the Chinese experience doesn't actually work in emerging market countries, well, it does. And they have actually learned from the best practices globally. So there are issues in China that by no means, they're facing potential, debt overhang, which can get out of hand fairly quickly, in spite of their savings, in spite of the fact that Chinese households with 45-50% savings rate actually have sitting on a lot of money, and could be that sort of, if they open up the ability of Chinese individuals to invest abroad, there's a huge amount of capital waiting there in China that could be utilized in Indonesia or Pakistan and so on. And then there's the issue of Chinese firms moving out of China into more labor-intensive, the more labor-intensive firms to countries like Bangladesh and Philippines and Indonesia, because it's cheaper for them to work there. So in a sense, you do get some equilibration of investments, but macro prudential is critical. I absolutely agree with Atif on that.
Any other comments? Either Pakata, please. Yeah.
I just want to comment that what Professor Mian explained about this, the importance of the macroprudential. Indonesia is really an example of this, because during the 2008 global financial crisis, the US introduced the quantitative easing, and there was a massive capital inflow come to into emerging economies, including Indonesia, India, South Africa, Brazil, etc. And was very difficult for us to manage that, because if we believe in the so-called the impossible trinity, the unholy trinity, was very expensive for a central bank to do the sterilization, because the spread between the central bank and the Fed fund rate. If we let the exchange rate to appreciate, it's going to kill our export. Under this kind of situation, so like it or not, we need to introduce this macro prudential. But the problem, Professor Mian, in the case of Indonesia, we adopted the open capital regime. So if we discuss like introduce the Tobin tax, then the capital, we have to go to the parliament. And once we discuss with the parliament, the capital will leave the country before we introduce this kind of Tobin tax. So in my experience, we introduced the so-called the reverse Tobin tax. So if they don't repatriate the profit, but instead they reinvest again, we give the tax break, and then we encourage them, to go to the export-oriented sector, because this is naturally hedged. So that kind of model somehow probably will link these capital flows into the the quote unquote more the productive sector. I'm not too worried so much if these capital flows come in the form of the foreign direct investment. Yeah, but if this come under the portfolio, like what happened to us in the 2008, we had to face the problem of the taper tantrum 2013 when the capital back to the US and the currency in emerging market collapsed. So I completely agree about the importance of this macro prudential.
Right. Maybe if we can just pivot slightly. I wanted to come back to some of your comments. And I know it's a very different set of topics, but it also, I think, is deeply intertwined with the conversation we've been having. One of the challenges we have looking forward as it comes to social protection measures across our region is that countries have really ramped up spending in 2020, 2021, and they've done it against the backdrop of a really collapsing domestic revenue base as a consequence of COVID-19. A bit of the conversation we're having seems to imply that the country shouldn't be so worried about fiscal space, but from a traditional perspective, at least, they seem to have relatively tight fiscal space. From what you've seen, what are the most important sort of social protection measures that countries need to be focused on? You talked about education earlier. You talked about basic income, but I'd like to hear from you about how you categorize or prioritize actions going forward.
No, I think this is a good question. And again, it's going to depend a little bit country to country, just on the stage of development the country is in, and also the health situation in the country. And so, for example, a country like Indonesia, which is going through a very bad surge right now, where the partial lockdown has just been implemented, you need to get food out the door to the most vulnerable. And so you really need to be focused on what can you do to just make sure people are surviving the lockdown, and also that the lockdown is successful, and making sure that people stay home during it. And so huge amounts the resources in terms of just getting cash out the door during these very extreme events, I think, is really important. But I agree with you. I think this is the big problem right now, is that there's just for a lot of countries, I feel like there's a lot of fiscal space. There's also a lot of demands on budgets. There's health spending, there's education, there's social protection, and that's just within the social. That's just my area of the sort of the social spending, much less thinking about broader investment areas that we're talking about here today. And I think here is where I really want to note that this is where I think information and research can really help guide us. And we have in some areas of social protection, we have a wide body of research that we've built up in terms of, for example, how to make schools more effective and what kind of investments we could put into place to do that. In the social safety net space where I work, there's a whole bunch of research showing how, you could do cash transfers. They're very effective. They're much cheaper than food distributions, and putting it at the emergency times where you might need some food distribution, are very effective. And you don't see a decrease in unemployment, you don't see people spending on bad things, and it's much cheaper to deliver and much easier to deliver. And so the research is building up there. Where I think we need a lot more research, and where I'm starting to see some, but there's not enough, is more on the active labor market policy space. A lot of the emerging research is showing that a lot of the jobs trainings programs haven't worked. And there's now a body of evidence from lots of developing countries that they haven't necessarily worked, but then you're starting to see sort of glimmers of things that might be working. So you see like apprenticeship programs or on-the-job programs might be working. And so it's trying to think more creatively about how we do job matching, how we do job training, that it's actually generating more jobs and not just having displacement effect. I think it's another area where research is really needed in terms of driving things forward. But I think it all comes down to this issue that if we really want to use the money wisely, we really want to take a step back, look holistically at the different types of programs we need, the different types of people who need assistance, and then think about what the research says in terms of how we can deliver it better, and where we don't know and where there isn't research. I think there is really there we want to experiment more and try out different things to really understand what we could do better to use money more effectively in terms of getting help out to people.
Any perspectives, on the ground perspectives on this question from Indonesia, perhaps, Pak Katib? Pak Katib, I think you're on mute right now.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry, I just want to follow up what Rima mentioned. Yeah. Now Indonesia introduced the so-called the partial lockdown, but a country like Indonesia, we don't really have a very good social security. This partial lockdown somehow is in favor, biased towards the middle and upper income group because they do have savings. But what about the poor one? You ask them to stay at home and you don't compensate them. So that is why there is a need for the government to provide the cash transfer. At the same time, to access for vaccine, for testing, for the PCR, for example, is also very important to support the small medium enterprise. But the question is, where does the money come from? How do we finance this? Yeah, this is really the key issue. A year ago, we had an opportunities actually. Rima, Ben Olken, and myself, we proposed one policy which is probably, I believe that probably this is something worth to be, to be explored. In a country like Indonesia and some countries in Asia or emerging market, we continue to subsidize the fossil fuel. Yeah, you will be surprised that the fossil fuel subsidy in Indonesia is even larger than the spending on health. Yeah, so we argue that probably it is worth to explore the possibility to introduce the so-called the excise for the fossil fuel, or let the fossil fuel using the market, let the market work. And then I do believe that this kind of policy is like a triple win. Yeah, we can use this money to support the social assistance program, the health, and also the small medium enterprise. And this is politically sound, Ahmed. Why? Because we use the money to support the poor people. Politically, people will support that. The second one, this is also sound for them from the environmental perspective because it will reduce the demand for the fossil fuel. And it's also good for the macro because, somehow you make your budget healthy. So that kind of model perhaps is sort of like an example that worth to be explored.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You please, Atishan, please.
Yeah, I think that I really do think a carbon tax is a very good idea, especially if you also have a regional or local piggyback. For example, Jakarta should clearly have a higher rate than sort of the interior of Sumatra and so on. The issue really is about how one deals with the informal sector, particularly in large metropolitan areas, and the dynamics of people moving to find jobs. The old development theories of people moving to find incomes and jobs, and that's what drives the development process. The trouble is that there are too many people in Jakarta, or too many people in Guangzhou, or too many people in Mexico City. And unless you also look at the spatial dimensions of inequality, which is inequality in Mexico of the southern states, in Pakistan it's the western provinces, in China it's the western states and the interior provinces, you're not going to be able to actually have a more balanced development of employment in the long run. You want sustainable employment, particularly for the informal sector, labor-intensive activities in compact, clean, connected cities. The trouble is that it's not enough just to build a high-speed train or a highway between point A and point B, or Chile has a very good north-south highway, but all it does is permits people to come into Santiago de Chile, where there are no jobs. So then you end up giving them cash transfers to keep them alive. So really the issue should be to look at a overall picture, look at where the public investment should be going and how it should be financed, and really designed to facilitate productive private investment. So really what one is looking at is enabling public investment and local public services. So that brings us back to the multi-level finance issue, which I think, it's implicit in what Pak Shatib is saying, but, most of the provision of basic services or education or health or social protection is at the local level. So how you get money to them and how do you get them to be accountable is really the rub of the issue.
Thank you. I think there was no way we were going to be able to unpack all the ideas in an hour session, but I think this was. I want to thank everybody. Obviously, we're honored that you all joined us. Just maybe a closing thought from me. It's interesting. If we think about sort of the framing of the question of saving lives, as Atif put it in the beginning, one implication is that actually the world needs developing countries to provide high quality investment opportunities because that's an alternative way for these curves to ultimately balance. We're also in a time when the world will need. We talked a bit about towards the end about carbon tax. We're also all in one boat when it comes to decarbonization. And so I think one of the things that I take away from this conversation is just how interlinked we all are. How a phenomena of the wealthiest and the most developed countries both creates risk and opportunity for the poorest. I think on the promising side, one thing that I take away from this conversation is that while we have great need, some of the things Rima talked about, but also some of the things that others talked about in terms of investment needs for developing countries, there are enough tools around the table, if assembled properly, to start chipping away at these things and to make progress. So let me just once again say thank you. We're obviously grateful to our audience for joining us, to the IEA for its partnership with ADB, but most of all to my fellow panelists who've taken time from their busy schedules. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.